So we're going to reframe a little bit here just in terms of, this is the reclamation room. I want to say here that reclamation and this conversation around expectations, we're not looking for perfection. We're not looking for people to show up in every moment fully aware of their subconscious expectations and having a conversation off the bat of what are your expectations here? Okay, we have to know that we're people, we're in flow, we're living a life. We have to be able to adapt. And so, what we're looking for is honesty and self trust. And that means that we're going to be choosing relationships where clarity is allowed, if possible. And if you're in one already where that's not the case, then you can be honest with yourself and start building that trust within yourself because you do deserve more in the future. You are worthy of more in the future, but you're also worthy of more right now. And that means within you. Hey there, and welcome to the Reclamation Room. I'm Ashana, and I'm so glad you're here. This is a space for women reclaiming themselves after narcissistic abuse. If you've ever felt like you were too much, not enough, or both at the same time, you're in the right place. I created this podcast because I know what it's like to lose yourself in overgiving, overperforming, and still wondering why it never felt like love. I've walked through trauma, toxic relationships, and the long road of self-reclamation, and I'm here to walk with you. In this podcast, we'll explore what it means to come home to yourself after the confusion and chaos of narcissistic abuse. Some episodes will be solo, others will include guest interviews. All of them will be honest, grounded, and deeply compassionate. So, whether you're just realizing what you've lived through, or you've been on this path and you're ready for the next layer of your healing, you are welcome here. This is not about perfection. This is about reclamation. Hey guys, welcome back to the Reclamation Room. This is going to be a solo episode. I haven't had one since October, which was crazy to me. I can't believe it's been that long. But it's also one that's bringing me a little bit of nervousness, if I'm being honest. This is a very intimate conversation. It started because I was thinking about two situations that happened in my life, and I'm still processing them. I'm still working through what those meant for me. So I thought it would be fun to come on here and share with you what those situations were, the processing and how that's going, and how this can apply for people who maybe are going through situations in their relationships that are uncomfortable, don't feel good, might be kind of awkward, or if there's something that you've been through that you can't quite let go of. And when I'm talking, you're feeling it and you're like, yep, that's a stuck point for me. So this episode is going to be talking about expectations in relationships. I realized this was the main focal point of what was going on here for me. And I know that we talk about boundaries a lot. Obviously, it's a thing. But I think that there's a nuance underlying boundaries, and that's expectation. And I think it's really important that we talk about that, bring it out, give it air. Let's look at what our motives are here. This episode is not going to be about giving you advice or helping you fix something or giving you step by step on how to have healthy expectations. My hope is that this episode can maybe help you notice something that everyone feels, but I don't know that it's explicitly named, sometimes possibly because we don't have the words to do so. So I'm realizing through these situations in my life that a lot of conflict I've faced, and I would say many of us have faced, isn't necessarily about boundaries themselves. I think a lot of times it boils down to expectations that we haven't realized we're carrying, and maybe the other person hasn't either. Maybe we haven't realized that they have expectations too, and vice versa. And so this can apply to friendships, to family, to work situations, and of course, romantic relationships. And I'll just say here that, especially in romantic relationships, as we get older, these are often our closest relationships. And this is where we become our best and our worst self, right? It's our most intimate self. And we can lay some of these things down and be that person who we are deep down. And that can also cause panic. It can also feel very unsafe. And it can be a beautiful thing. But I think when we bring expectations into it, like you'll hear in a minute, it can cause it to feel even scarier, even more high stakes. So hopefully this episode can help us feel a little bit safer and maybe process some of this a little more with a little more self-awareness. So I'll say before we do get deeper into this conversation, some of what I will say here assumes emotional safety already in your life. And so just really bringing awareness to the fact that abuse changes what might be possible for us in the moment. Because if we are in an abusive or coercive relationship, our nervous system may actually be focused on survival and not so much on communication, not so much on the nuance of what's going to feel good and move that needle forward for both of us mutually. So if speaking honestly isn't something that feels safe for you right now, I want you to still know that you can listen to this episode, and I will give you some reframes at the end, or at least more towards the end, that can better tailor this to your situation. I want you to know that if you skim over some of the middle parts, that's not going to be avoidance. That's not something that is a failure on your part. That's actually a nervous system intelligence per se, because you may realize that that's not safe for you in this moment, and that's totally okay. So some of these reflections may be more internal for you. And I want you to know that I'm not asking anyone to confront any of these situations or take action. I'm going to be sharing what has come up for me and how I've processed it. And I would love for you to share if anything comes up for you. If you have any comments, please always feel free to leave those for me and we can continue the discussion. So I'll also have in the show notes a link to my private community where you are welcome to join and we can continue the discussion there. And also the weekly women's call that we have every Tuesday evening where we talk about things exactly like this. So diving into the episode, expectations. What are they? What is this? You know, we hear it and we have them, but do we ever really stop to think of like what is the concept that these are holding in our life? So expectations can be an assumption, and we already have a negative nuance that we can give to that, a negative connotation. When I assume, I make an ass out of you and me. I know a lot of us have probably heard that. I want to say here, assumptions don't necessarily mean something negative. Okay. This is just logic making. This is meaning making. This is what we do as humans. And so we can have these assumptions that we're making internally about access that we have to others, access that others have to us, availability that we can have within the relationship, within our time, what our roles may be, what we expect the other person's role to be, what that may include, what kind of emotional labor might be involved, what kind of burdens are we expecting ourselves to carry or are we expecting others to carry. And so we could say here that expectations that we bring into relationships are kind of like these invisible agreements that we think everyone signed at some point because they feel like common sense to us. We're just like, well, duh, this is what needs to happen here. And I think a lot of times in my personal life and also in my work with clients, especially couples situations, where we really do assume that the other person is aware of what we're expecting because it just makes sense and that's what's needed for the situation. And it gets muddy when the other person is doing the same thing and we may not be aware of what their expectations are. So these can really get more complicated, especially after we have experienced relational harm. And so when we're bringing in a past history of abuse of any kind, betrayal, any kind of complex trauma that we've carried forward with us, we need to understand that the expectations we are holding, even subconsciously, these have actually become survival strategies at some point. This is not just the way that we think about things or how we think life should be because that's ideal for us. Of course, they could be, but just know that there's likely the possibility that some of those expectations are not the same thing that you would choose if you hadn't been through what you had been through. So really keeping in mind here that what we have experienced is forming who we are in the present moment, and that's informing who we are in the future. And it's often based on how we act and how we show up in everyday situations. So, of course, the goal, as we all know, everyone's seeking enlightenment, right? Everyone's seeking presence and nervous system regulation and calm. But just knowing it's enough right now to recognize that this could be happening. These expectations might have gone underground per se. They're still like watering the flowers of who you are from underneath, and we might not even be aware that they're there. So, an example of this for me, people used to say that I would hold them out very far and not trust them. And I would constantly do things in relationships that was forcing them to show their love for me. So, it turned into kind of a test, right? And so this isn't something that I was aware of. In fact, when people said that to me, I would be, oh my gosh, I'm indignant, right? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't do that. You're crazy. Stop telling me that I am this way. But later on in life, I looked back and I was like, wow, like I really didn't trust people. And I really did just want them to keep showing up and keep wanting me and keep choosing me and keep being kind to me, even when I was at my worst. And I wasn't being my worst on purpose, right? It's not a choice that I was making. But I was really terrified that people weren't going to love me. And so I was subconsciously testing them to see, are you going to leave? That was an expectation I had. I expected that they were going to leave. And yet, subconsciously, I deeply expected people to show up and love me and not want to abandon me. And so sometimes our expectations can even be contradicting one another. And this can bring about these anxieties and fears that we have of like, I'm so emotionally overwhelmed right now because I want multiple things at once. And I don't understand how that's possible. But I'm telling you, especially after abuse and betrayal, it's very possible. Does it make cognitive sense to us? No. But hopefully after this episode, it can make a little more sense and maybe we can relax into it and say, okay, I get why I'm doing this. It's okay. So just knowing that trauma can turn our expectations into a sense of protection sometimes can disarm that alarm bell that might be going off saying there's something wrong with us. And reminding you here that the things that we choose subconsciously as survival strategies, they don't really come with instruction manuals. So no wonder it feels like things can get out of hand in conversation, right? We don't even know what we're doing with it half the time. And we may be showing up with expectations that the other person can handle it in a way that feels good for us, and vice versa. So always remembering, especially in a safe situation, that we're both often bringing similar dynamics to the table. So I'll give you an example here. I actually have two. The first one is a friendship that I had that recently ended. And I'll say here, like, I don't know exactly why it ended. There are a couple of different reasons. Of course, I can speculate and I'll share a little bit more. But just know going in, like, I'm a human and I'm looking at this from the perspective of a human who doesn't know everything. So I'll say here that in this friendship, I genuinely cared for this person. This isn't a person that I ever felt was a burden to me or annoying in any way. But I also know that I have a past history of consistently holding space for people, even when it felt like it was too much for what I could handle in that moment. I would just keep holding the space. Did they bother me? No. Were they on my nerves? No. Should I have likely set a boundary and said, okay, I need more space to recharge before we have this conversation? Probably. So just know that going in. But I was starting to feel like this friendship was slightly one-sided in that there was a lot of space holding going on my part. And sometimes it would even be to the degree that I wouldn't know what to say. It wouldn't be information that was conducive to a conversation. It would end and I would say, well, how am I supposed to respond to this? There was no question. There was no invitation for further discussion. There was no opening left for me to be a part of it. It just felt like there was things being placed upon me and I was being asked to hold them, right? So in my mind, there was this expectation that I would hold these things for this person. And there wasn't much space left for me to exist in that room. There was very few times that, the person asked how I was doing or what was going on with me. And of course, there were days where I was more talkative and I would just openly share what was going on with me. And I would say to myself, see, this is a normal friendship, right? This is how friendship works. We tell each other about our days. But I did start noticing that the amount of incoming information to me was beginning to be a lot more. And I noticed that it was often in times of emotional overwhelm when the information that was being shared was more triggering, was more intense, I felt like I needed to be helping this person calm down and process things versus just being there with that person. And the reason I say this is because a lot of times when I would have that boundary with myself and say, okay, you don't always have to help, let's just be there. And I would do that. The feedback that I would receive from this person was then they would be short with me. Then they would be radio silent on me. Then they would talk to me less. And then they would make comments that kind of felt like, okay, well, you just don't get it. So I'm going to go talk to this other friend. This was something that I've faced in my life before. And I thought to myself, gosh, like, how do I end up in these same situations? Obviously, from the outside looking in, hey, maybe start setting boundaries sooner and don't be holding space and holding space and holding space. Well, at this point, I didn't really know how to handle it in a way that felt aligned for me and kind for the other person. And so I was uncomfortable. And so I pulled back a little bit and I just stopped participating in conversations that didn't feel good for me. So when the conversation crossed the line into talking badly about other people, calling people names, really a lot of like an us versus them situation where I felt like I had to take sides and be on someone's side, I just wouldn't. And I would kind of pull back a little bit and say something very neutral, like, I hope it all works out for you. And I recognized that the more I did that, the less this person would come around and have conversation with me. Now, at this point, I had a choice, right? I could have named that discomfort and I could have said, hey, listen, it really feels like the relationship is going more in this one-sided direction. I'm not going to be available for conversations that are talking about people in this way, but I'm still here for you and I still cherish you and I definitely still want to be friends. I didn't do that so much. Now, I had an expectation here, looking back, that this person would notice my discomfort, would notice my distance and be self-aware in my opinion, right? Remember, this is just my perception, and be self-aware of what they were doing and say, oh, okay, this doesn't feel good. Let me take a look and see if there's anything that I can work on here. Well, I wasn't thinking at the time that this person might be experiencing my distance without the context that I had, and their feelings might be hurt because I was just being more distant with them and not explaining why and not saying, hey, there's something here that's causing me to feel uncomfortable. And so I changed my participation in that relationship without explaining the change. It makes sense to me. It was protective for me. Looking back, we can say, yeah, of course you would do that. That was a boundary. But I'm just recognizing here that it also could have been confusing to the other person. And I'll say again here, this assumes safety in the relationship. So if you're in a relationship or a friendship where the other person is genuinely harming you and you are experiencing abuse or coercion, this does not apply to you as much. And I'll give questions later to kind of help dig into these concepts for you. But I'll say here that there were two people in the friendship and there were two sets of unspoken expectations. I'm not sure what the other person's expectations were. But I do know that the person eventually came and said, I don't feel like this friendship is aligned anymore. It doesn't feel like a friendship anymore, and it hasn't for a really long time. And I recognized that it hadn't felt like a friendship to this person starting around the time that I was becoming more distant, which makes total sense. Because if that person is not getting the same level of closeness they were before, they could feel like that's not a friendship anymore. And so I had to be aware of maybe we were operating on different versions of what friendship is. Maybe we have different expectations of what a friendship asks for. Am I taking all of this on myself and saying it's my fault for not communicating my expectations? No. And sometimes relationships end and there's not someone in the wrong. Maybe there's not a bad guy, right? Maybe they just end because the expectations changed and neither one of us named it. Neither one of us named it to begin with, and neither one of us named it when they changed. And so I realized that I was still feeling like I wanted to explain myself and tell this person, like, hey, wait, like, this isn't fair. I feel like when I stopped holding all of that space for you, suddenly you decided that you didn't want to be friends anymore. So I had two choices. I could go back and I could try to say that, or I could move forward and let it be what it is and process as things come up. And that is the choice that I made. I don't feel like that is a friendship that I would want to preserve in that way. And that's, personal to each person. I did try to make a few comments here and there to let the person know that I was uncomfortable with gossip, and that continued. And so based on that, I'm making the decision that I don't want to try, and that's okay. I don't have to be mad at anyone. But it was a really good way for these expectations to come into my awareness and for me to say, oh, okay, like how has this happened in other relationships in the past? I'm glad it happened in this safe place that I'm able to feel it. So I just want to make a distinction here. We have expectations, which is what we genuinely hope for, right? We hope for these things in a relationship. They make sense to us. Boundaries is more of what we must do or how we must be in terms of, are we going to be more distant from a person, or are we going to have that safe guard put up if those hopes aren't met in a way that feels safe? So my boundary in that moment wasn't, well, you need to stop treating me this way or I'm not going to be your friend anymore. Could it have been? Yes. But I had to really look at my expectation was that this person was going to be aware of me too. And the boundary for that person ended up being, okay, this doesn't feel like a friendship to me, so I don't want this to be a friendship anymore. I had to get really clear here on what was expectations and what was boundaries, because to me, it felt like the boundary was kind of a replacement for conversation. Rather than having a conversation, the boundary was placed and, hey, the friendship is over. But I also realized on my part that expectations without having that conversation turned into resentment. And so this person likely felt like they needed to set that boundary. So there's a lot at play here, and it's a really dynamic situation where things can change and there's many moving parts, because a lot of times if you set boundaries and there's not context for the boundaries, we haven't had that conversation about expectations, well, then a boundary can feel like an ultimatum. And that brings me to my second real life example here. So I had a client call recently who wanted to work on safety. This client felt particularly blindsided and betrayed, rightfully so, due to things that had happened. And this person really wanted help with setting boundaries and figuring out how to hold themselves to those and how to actually have consequences in place that they could follow and feel good about. This was difficult because the person did not in any way want to end the relationship with the other person, but they had felt unheard in the past and they were really struggling with maintaining consequences. And so we just had a really honest talk about, where have you guys been in conversation prior to this? Does this person know what the expectations are? And do you know what theirs are? And have you had a conversation to determine if these are even compatible? Because if not, and you're just giving this list of boundaries, and then there's going to be consequences if the boundaries aren't met to the other person, that likely does feel like an ultimatum. And that might be why this person is so triggered and saying, this isn't fair. This feels like a power struggle to me, because to them, it genuinely does. And so I think it's important here to understand when we're setting boundaries, and why expectations are so important to be aware of is because it's really difficult to enforce an agreement that was never made between two people. And so boundaries work best when they're built on a shared understanding. And I'll say here, that's not always possible. I think I've told you guys before about how I do not have contact with a lot of my family, and that was a boundary that I set in place after many failed attempts at reconciliation and understanding mutually. And it just wasn't feeling possible. To me, it wasn't so much getting on the same page as just being aware that both of us had a side and that parts of both can be right. That was my story. In another person's story, you may have endured abuse where both parts aren't right. And that could be a situation where there does not need to be reconciliation. There does not need to be a shared understanding. For your safety, boundaries may have to be completely one-sided. And that is totally understandable. And I'm not in any way indicating that a victim of abuse needs to have this agreement with this other person about expectations. Rather, for you, this could be an opportunity to look at your expectations in the future and the expectations that you might be holding for yourself, even subconsciously, as a result of the abuse. So I'll say here with this client, what we came up with moving forward was that they genuinely wanted to have the conversation with the other person and figure out what both of their expectations were. What do we think each other's roles are here? What do we think this relationship actually means? Because if we're not aware of that, and one of us is setting boundaries with consequences and the other is setting boundaries with consequences, it just feels like we're trying to control one another, and it doesn't really feel like a collaborative effort. And so, again, this assumes emotional safety in the relationship, but that's just another example that led me to this episode and recognizing that there are things happening underlyingly that we completely understand and are such common sense to us. And the other person may be completely unaware and not even be on the same page if we had the conversation. So, I have a few questions here, and I would love if you just pause this and take some time to feel into it if it feels right for you. If not, you can always come back to it later. But these are great journaling prompts. And like I said earlier, you're welcome to leave comments. You're welcome to join the conversation in our community. But I'll say here, questions that we can ask ourselves to kind of tune into these expectations in varying relationships could be like, what am I assuming that the other person already knows? Or what am I hoping will change without me actually naming it? What kind of expectation feels obvious to me right now? And if you're in a more abusive relationship, I would like you to look at this from a different angle and just be honest with yourself here and really hold space for, what am I doing right now that's helping me survive? What do I need to keep private in order to stay safe? And what does my body already know, even if I can't say it out loud? So I just want you to really know here that when we're in an abuse situation, our self trust doesn't just disappear. It kind of lays low for a while. It might have to in order for us to feel safe. There's no shame in that. But you can invite it back little by little, and you can start getting more in touch with yourself and recognizing that what is happening, what you're doing in real time might be your most intelligent way to stay safe. So we're going to reframe a little bit here just in terms of, this is the reclamation room. I want to say here that reclamation and this conversation around expectations, we're not looking for perfection. We're not looking for people to show up in every moment fully aware of their subconscious expectations and having a conversation off the bat of, what are your expectations here? Okay, we have to know that we're people, we're in flow, we're living a life. We have to be able to adapt. And so what we're looking for is honesty and self-trust. And that means that we're going to be choosing relationships where clarity is allowed, if possible. And if you're in one already where that's not the case, then you can be honest with yourself and start building that trust within yourself, because you do deserve more in the future. You are worthy of more in the future, but you're also worthy of more right now. And that means within you. So saying here that clarity, I said, remember, we want relationships where clarity is allowed. Reminder here that clarity does not mean being right. Sometimes it's about being vulnerable and being real and being honest enough to let the other person genuinely know you. And the same for them. You want clarity from them. I want to know what you're really going through. I want to really know what you're feeling and what you're wanting here, because that is when I can deeply know you. We can't know one another if we have these walls up. And we often have these walls up when our expectations have been not met for so long, or if they've been used against us. So it's not removing our expectations. It's not going from one extreme to the other of people pleasing or completely shutting down and being really firm on our expectations and never letting a person in if they can't meet them. Just knowing that it's being able to speak your expectations without punishment, because that's healthy. And so it's difficult, this balance of this episode of holding space for two realities. Perhaps you're in a situation where you can't speak those expectations and punishment will be there. But I want you to know that with everything that I say on this show, there's no urgency. I don't want you to feel pressured. There's no hierarchy of healing here where you have to have this in order to get to this next step. I always want you to know that wherever you are, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not bad. You're not doing it wrong. You're not going to get in trouble if you do it wrong. And you don't have to rush, especially when it comes to clarity. That's something that you need to feel safe, and you're allowed to actually take your time and arrive slowly into that. Sometimes it feels more like an exploration than a realization. So if this conversation connected for you and maybe you want a little bit more help, maybe you just need kind of a dumping ground for someone to say, hey, I'm here, I'm listening, it's safe to talk about your expectations here. I want you to know that that's actually what I do. I'm here for what I call reclamation coaching. but really in supporting women who are navigating relational harm and the aftermath that comes from that. So I have several safe spaces for what I hope can help bring clarity and self-trust and nervous system support. Like I mentioned earlier, I have my free community online, and I also have a weekly women's circle. And I do offer one-on-one calls if that's something that resonates for you. I'll leave all the links to these in the show notes below. So I want to end this episode with saying, if you're leaving kind of feeling uncomfortable or like something was kind of touching on a nerve ending and you're not sure what to do with it now, I want you to know that it's completely okay if you've listened to this episode and realized that maybe you had expectations that you never named, or maybe people had expectations of you that felt unfair. Or if you're listening and you're realizing that you can't name your expectations because it's not safe to do so, none of these things mean that you failed. None of these things mean that you're doing it wrong. This isn't something that you have to figure out today or figure out what to do. Because clarity and reclamation, these are not moral achievements. When I say these words, these are not things that imply that you have to have these to be good at being relational with other humans. It's just things that we can look to that become possible when we do feel safety and when we do feel self-trust. And as you heard in the beginning of this episode, these are things that I'm still working on too. This is an ongoing thing. We have triggers that pop up. We have situations that are hurtful or confusing. And like I said, we adapt and we grow and we learn more about ourselves and about how we want to show up for others. So wherever you are right now, whether you are rebuilding, surviving, questioning, or even just noticing things, I want you to know that you're not behind. You're right where you are, and that's totally okay. And if you do want support untangling all of this in a way that honors your nervous system, I'm going to leave ways that you can connect with me in the show notes. You don't have to rush. You don't have to feel pressured. Just know that these episodes are here, hopefully, to bring more information to help you grow closer to yourself and understand yourself and love yourself more, not to further show that there's a problem. Okay, so I'm sending you love this week. Hopefully, we will be releasing season 2 soon. I actually have to record the trailer for that. But in season 2, I'll give you a little teaser. We're going to be having more solo episodes like this one. We will still have guest episodes, but they're going to be sprinkled in as kind of a throwback to season 1. And we're going to be tackling more specific topics and action steps and reflections that we can have moving forward as we're recovering, as we're rebuilding, as we're growing. And so if you ever have any topics that you would like to hear covered on the show, you can leave them in the comments or you can email me at ashana@wayhomewellness.com. Thanks for spending time in the Reclamation Room. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if this supported you, consider sharing it or leaving a review. You're not alone, and your reclamation is sacred.